Gordon.
Thank you very much, Ross. Are we live? We good? A very warm welcome to all of you. Wonderful to see old friends and Vega graduates, and then Ross. Well done, Creative Mornings, Ross and your team, for continuing these conversations. And I think that's part of a greater humanity that's evolved, what with the TED Talks, what we're having here. We seem to be continuing global conversations, which I think could prevent another war. Let's hope so. I'm very happy to share some thoughts with you on this amazingly interesting topic called empathy. And my interest in this topic really goes back to my childhood in a racist home. My mother and father, dear people passed on, were rabid racists. And my best friend at home, and it's always intrigued me about racists that they give their children to be looked after by the darkie, which was always extraordinary. So my closest friend was Moses, our cook, or as my mother would call Moses, the cook boy, who was older than my mother. And with my close friendship with Moses, who used to take me up to eat much cooler food, like fried flying ants with pap. I thought, but why do my parents dislike Moses and the garden boy, who was also my friend? And this really troubled me throughout my childhood and later. I then went to schools, rather privileged schools, in the then Zimbabwe, where we were taught about joining the army and doing cadets, which I refused to do, not because I was heroic. I just didn't understand who these terrorists really were. No one could sort of explain why they were bad people who seemingly just wanted to share. So without knowing the word empathy, I think I was always conscious of the other, and not to suggest I was any saint at all. I then was privileged to have an English teacher, a mad Irishman called Michael O'Brien, who was entirely politically incorrect, and through literature really challenged us to think about the human condition. Of course, much later, and you'll be intrigued to know that this topic is really only gaining traction at the turn of the century. These books and the others, and they all were published. I think this first one was 2009 to the left. This last one, 2014, and there's another one, 2013. And similarly, there's been a slew of books all about what does it mean to be human, also at the turn of the century. Clearly, the human race is a very slow learner, because only now we're sort of questioning, well, who are we really? And is empathy part of our humanity, and should it be? of course, there's a huge connection between what does it mean to be human and empathetic behavior. We used to think this wasn't the case because of an incomplete reading of Charles Darwin, and from him we believed that our purpose really was survival of the fittest. The Americans still believe that. But closer readings of Darwin and his astute observations were that yes, living entities are driven to survive, but they also, in surviving, have embedded hardwiring to collaborate and to take care of the other. So again, this has only sort of come out with perhaps better scientists interpreting earlier work. There have been some interesting experiments with regard to empathy, which included infants, little sausages, in a nursery. And the experiment, to shortcut, these sort of experiments are often made quite complicated, but they would have another room of little infants who probably were pricked or whatever, but they were made to cry in the other room. And they found the infants next door became incredibly anxious and concerned and would start, some of them would also start crying, suggesting that indeed biologically we are wired to have anxiety about another person's suffering. I thought that was quite an interesting experiment. The word empathy and the concept has sort of evolved from the 19th century only in terms of words to express it. And we think that the first word was this German word, Einfühlung. It's meant to have 2 dots, but I couldn't find them on the computer. On the one U. I didn't have you, Ross. So Einfühlung was really a concept in the subject of aesthetics, learning and understanding beauty, which meant how to really project yourself into appreciating art, design, and so on. And that was the beginning of a little trail that I'll walk you through to get to the word empathy. We then had also from Germany another philosopher, Dieter, who expanded the concept to describe how one enters another person, a being, and comes to know how they feel and think. This then became a translation by a psychologist, Titchener, who drew on a Greek word, pathos, and M, and we had the word empathy. This was early in the 20th century. So the original literal meaning of empathy is to have feeling for suffering. People who are in some form of anxiety, that you can sense that anxiety. Martin Hoffman sort of expanded it a little bit further, that having empathy enables us to have feelings more congruent with another situation than one's own. In other words, you put yourself on hold, quite difficult, and engage and become another. Very difficult. I'll come back to that point. He's having a little moment. Okay. So empathy and ability to resonate with others, but we've taken it a little bit further, that it's not only about I feel and am with you in your pain, but we now are using the term I can be with you in your joy and happiness. That's also now the more modern extension of the concept of empathy. There remains quite a bit of confusion between empathy, however, and sympathy. And the way I see it is sympathy is more a passive emotion. I'm sorry for you, my China. But the world will be moving on, and so will I. And it has a bit of a pity connotation, not always intended to be such. I think empathy, in fact I'm sure, empathy is a far more active concept. You have to work incredibly hard to really gain empathy. And I'm always amused at quantitative research that sometimes we do in agencies to really get inside people, whatever. And of course, this has to be followed by young Alan, which caused a global outpouring of both sympathy and empathy. And fortunately, a lot of empathy that even got tight-assed David Cameron to allow some refugees into tight-assed Britain. Are you allowed to use such language in Creative Mornings? I did read somewhere, which I was really quite chuffed, with a statement that there's a correlation between people who swear and intelligence. Fucking amazing. But of course, I'm sure everyone in this room really paused over this terrible image. To understand empathy, as is often the case, let's look at the opposite. And the absolute opposite of an empathetic person is a psychopath. They're usually CEOs of companies. There's been a... No, he's not a CEO. Correct. But on a serious note, and there have been interesting research done on a prevalence of psychopathy in corporate CEOs, which was no shock to me. But a psychopath technically is absolutely devoid of any feeling for another person. And fortunately, there are not a whole lot of these people, but the problem is they often rise to the top. There was a chap called Adolf. So while there may be few, they can have extraordinary influence. That's another topic. So psychopathy is literally an absolute zero empathy with another human being. It's quite hard to kind of imagine that. Other ways to see the opposite is a narcissist, someone which comes from the word of always looking in the water to see your reflection. It's to be absolutely befucked by oneself. And of course, the Western culture, in terms of broad cultures, is quite a narcissistic culture. The me. And then, of course, other ways to describe the opposite of empathy is an indifference. Just get your shit together. Disengagement, disconnection, and separation. I thought this was a profound statement in a great film on the Nuremberg trial. I say great, I mean horrific. Evil is the absence of empathy. The age of introspection, living in love with oneself, pursuit of self-interest, which also happens in the corporate world, has been problematic. And I know a lot of other cultures, I think rightly see Western culture as quite brutish. And I believe it is, and I'm generalizing. It is brutish with regard to empathy. So rather than this age of introspection, there's been a really strong case made. We need an age of outrospection. This comes from one of the books, the cover, which I've already shown. Another book that I said I would point out, The Age of Empathy, Nature's Lessons for a Kinder Society. A really beautiful book. Our history, and I've just given a few examples, has very awe-inspiring movements and revolts by people who are demanding a more empathetic approach. The anti-slavery campaign, which eventually got some traction. This complete objectifying of people, thingifying of people. People were tradable stock. And this campaign was launched by people who began to have empathy with slaves. Been some great films illustrating that. The civil rights movement, of course, was all about a movement saying we too have a right to be treated as humans, and for you to show kindness, and to, more important perhaps, to give us dignity. We, of course, are sitting in a country that legalized separation, which is a cancelling of a people, and we're still trying to get our heads around fixing that. Sorry? I think you must have the time wrong. Can't have gone that quickly. And then the gender equality struggle, which continues. Do you know that the definition of Homo sapiens is men with wisdom? You know, which is also an oxymoron. But that's the definition of Homo sapiens. And you know, there were, in the last century, there were many essays, academic essays, with titles such as Are Women Human? So the gender equality struggle is also an uprising, if you like, to say we also deserve dignity and empathy. Enablers of empathy. Well, some of us are born in more empathetic cultures than others, which is already helpful. And we're blessed in Africa, I think, with many cultures that are more empathetic than a number of European cultures, certainly American cultures. Parenting behavior has a huge impact. Those of you who have children, the bad news is you have a large responsibility with regard to how empathetic your little sausages will be. I only learnt about this after I raised mine. So the enablers, how do you become, can you become more empathetic? Yes, you can force yourself to be more curious about people and the stories that, the unique stories that we all have. But this is work. This is work. And of course the great copywriters and designers work very hard to get inside, I hate to say the term, but the market. You have to remove self, so those of us with egos cannot be empathetic because it gets in the way. So removal of self is a critical condition. There has to be a fundamental underlying respect for humanity, that we indeed are a family of peoples with probably more similarities than differences. We have to become extraordinarily attentive to listening and seeing. And this is a lifelong exercise, I would suggest. I mean, often in this context we'll say, well, how well do you know your children or your partner? And certainly when they're teenagers, you say, I don't know who the fuck they are. I think you were saying that to Eugenie earlier about Ross, yeah. So yes, we can work at becoming more empathetic, but there are a lot of barriers. There are a lot of barriers. Prejudice is a fundamental barrier. And stereotyping, generalizations, those people, and they all look the same anyway. I mean, that's a non-starter. Of course, arrogance, hubris, is a fundamental barrier. A sense of superiority. You're going to now look down to find out who they are. You aren't going to get there. And of course, certainty. Well, I know who they are. And I hear too much in agencies. Yeah, we know our market. Get a life. You will never, ever know your market. Never. And when you start to get to know it, it changes. So it's just a continuous learning, which I think is very exciting. And of course, Clint Eastwood, who's made some great films that display a very sensitive empathy, makes the point that if you're insecure about yourself, you're going to have difficulty being empathetic. Of course, all the great poetry and art and writings and dance and song move us because the creators have been able to be empathetic about the human condition, about human emotion. So you can literally be reading a verse and you can start crying. I mean, how empathetic was that poet? So is there a correlation between great creative works and the ability to be empathetic? Without debate. Without debate. And of course, great designers, whether it's industrial or graphic, right on. Do not interrupt me again. Thank you, Roy. Spend a great deal of time, we use these terms of deep dives, immersions, prototyping. So it's not really at all new to the creative sector. And places like IDEA have shared their attempts and ways to become more empathetic. And as we start to wind up, I think what Goethe said, again, German, it's extraordinary that we had Adolf in this culture of incredibly brilliant, sensitive people, isn't it? I've never resolved that paradox. Except that he was in serious aberration. Man only knows man-woman, only knows him, herself, insofar as he knows the world. And I think, to me, a driver for you wanting to be more empathetic is the proposition: the more empathetic you can be, the more alive you will be. Thank you very much.
Two really empathetic questions. Anyone? No one? Google it.
Yes.
Find my photograph, which I should have quotes. insecurity about self.
Yeah, by Clint.
Yes,
Clint.
being a barrier. I would have thought that insecurity creates a situation which you are uncertain, and it makes you more open to what other people might be experiencing, as opposed to insecurity giving you an inability. Well, they say insecurity makes you unable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously not as good looking as Clint Eastwood.
Yes, you are.
But you see, I'm now interpreting what I think he meant. I think if you're very insecure, you're spending a lot of your time working yourself out. You're introverted. You're trying to resolve things. I think to me, it's difficult to be empathetic in that state. I mean, I don't think he's saying you have to be totally sorted, but there has to be some sense, you're okay, I can put myself on hold. I can put myself on hold, and I'm really interested in you. And you'll see people with lots of issues when you're having coffee. I mean, you can't get a word in. And another, yes, Michelle.
Could I maybe try and answer that? I think that, and something I noted while you're talking, there's a difference between insecurity and vulnerability. And I think that what insecurity does is it shuts you down and closes you up because you're afraid to open yourself and make yourself vulnerable because you are insecure. And I think the power of empathy is that it's linked to the ability to make yourself vulnerable to other people and what
Exactly. Okay, thank you for that. That wasn't a question, that was an elucidation and expansion. And is there any other question before we celebrate the birthday? Ross?
What kind of drives and inspires you to be empathetic? It's not the easiest part.
Well, I think I've been privileged to be with young people most of my life. And why has that helped me? Because I think because if you're an educator, you're kind of meant to be empathetic. So, and I've had such rewards by seeing things through another person's point of view. So for me, it's like it's given me rewards. It's given me enormous satisfaction and growth. But I read a lot of poetry and literature, which also fuels me. So there is another question. Yeben.
Do you think there's a correlation between patriarchy and lack of empathy?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think any sort of hierarchical system becomes a barrier to empathy. And even titles and positions. And I know it's difficult. Someone's going to say, well, what's the solution? But there are barriers. There are barriers. Of course, we're learning that you can be a CEO and be a human. You know, we're learning that slowly. Yes?
Do you think, and obviously in childhood, that empathy can be taught?
Yes, there's no debate. In fact, that's the most critical time.
No, I'm saying not in childhood.
Okay. So you missed all of that. So you're starting late.
All the psychological theories speak to like the development of empathy and
Correct.
attachment and in your early years.
Correct.
And do you think that later in life?
Yes, I do.
That empathy can continue?
Yes, I do. I think it's harder. But yes, and there are many examples. And it's a very good question because sadly sort of functional families are not the norm anymore. So, yeah.
PW was
Sorry?
I think PW is an example of that.
PW. Of?
Learning empathy at an old age.
I think he's still learning. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Do you think so? Can I just have a follow-on question? How do you think so?
Who?
How do you think that empathy can be taught to adults? I mean, in the context of South Africa, for example, where I think we've got a lot of people who came from, I suppose we didn't maybe have the attachment things or the things that develop empathy in such a violent society, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I think the violence is a side effect.
Of the lack of empathy.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's exactly.
It is a side
effect. In the context of that, how do you think, I mean, are you speaking to the art and creativity as a way of
definitely
of stimulating empathy?
Definitely education, which I don't think does enough to more consciously teach empathy. But I think the arts, I think a lot of these initiatives to deal with the sort of dysfunctional among us all contribute to teaching empathy. I believe you can. But I want to stress, it's hard work even if you had it at childhood. It's even harder if you missed it. Last question, then. Yes.
Sorry. So you mentioned how a piece of poetry or a piece of music could make you cry. If you had to look in terms of design, what kind of characteristics would a piece of design have to make you feel so empathetic towards it? Like,
well, I think even making something unbelievably functional comes through being empathetic. You know, the way you pick up something and the way your hand sort of wraps around it. That industrial designer is displaying empathy or is enacting empathy.
Have you ever cried sitting in a beautifully designed?
No, but you don't have to be crying to show empathy. But I mean, there are. I mean, I definitely had tears when I first was confronted by one of Van Gogh's original paintings. It was just like, fuck. Yeah. Okay, that's the last question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.